Men thought money could buy everything, even respect. But when a drunk, arrogant CEO mocked the royal guards simply because they didn't bow to him, no one expected what would happen next. What unfolded outside Buckingham Palace left the crowd stunned, and a nation rethinking the meaning of true power. This wasn't just a rude tourist making a scene. This was a collision between ego and tradition, between arrogance and quiet dignity. And in this courtyard steeped in history, something unforgettable took place. You think you've seen strength? Wait until this soldier speaks. His words didn't just silence a powerful man, they carried a lesson we all need to hear. If you believe dignity still matters in today's world, give this video a thumbs up, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to God Royals. We bring you real stories of courage, restraint, and timeless values every single day. Stay with us till the end, because when this royal guard finally breaks his silence, his words will stay with you long after the screen fades. Alexander Crane, age 45, a billionaire tech mogul whose face graces magazine covers, the kind of man who's used to being obeyed, not questioned. Back in New York, his word moves markets. His lifestyle? Private jets, designer suits, and power lunches that decide the future of industries. But today, none of that mattered. That afternoon, with champagne on his breath and a calendar full of deals, Alexander stepped out of a sleek black S-Class outside Buckingham Palace. This wasn't a meeting, it was a performance, and he expected the world to play along. But what he didn't count on was Ethan Ward. Standing guard in full uniform, Ethan appeared motionless to the crowd, but behind that stoic stare was a decorated soldier, a man who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, who had held the hands of fallen brothers, who woke each morning before sunrise to press every crease in his uniform, not for applause but in remembrance. He wasn't a statue, he wasn't for show. Ethan stood for something money can't buy: discipline, honor, and sacrifice. Where Alexander represented power that demands respect, Ethan embodied the kind of strength that earns it. One man stood tall because of his title, the other because of his principles. Before Ethan Ward ever wore the red tunic of the Royal Guard, he wore desert camouflage and heavy body armor. Years before Buckingham Palace, he had stood in another kind of heat, one not warmed by tradition, but by war. It was in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The air was dry, the wind sharp with dust and diesel. Ethan was only 24. His boots were new, his hands steady, and his mind trained for chaos. That day, his unit had been sent to secure a compound after reports of insurgent activity. It was supposed to be routine. It wasn't. Shots rang out from rooftops, screams crackled over the radio, smoke filled the sky. Ethan had taken cover behind a crumbled wall, his back pressed against stone, heart pounding like thunder in his ears. Just a few feet away, a fellow soldier, Danny Lewis, a father of 2, was hit. The blast had thrown him to the ground, silent and bleeding. Ethan crawled toward him, bullets ripping through the air above. He pressed his hand to Danny's chest, tried to stop the bleeding, called for a medic, but the response never came in time. Danny's final words weren't about anger, they were about home. "Tell my wife. I'm sorry I won't get to see her again," he whispered, and then silence. It was that silence Ethan remembered most, not the noise of gunfire, not the shouting, but the stillness that followed death. The gravity of it, the weight, that was the moment Ethan learned what real strength looked like. Not in how hard you hit, but in how long you could carry the memory and still stand tall. That was the moment he understood that some uniforms aren't just clothing, they're commitments, living tributes to those who never came back. So now, when tourists mocked him or powerful men tried to provoke him, Ethan didn't flinch. because nothing they said could compare to the weight of holding a brother in your arms as his life faded. Silence for Ethan wasn't weakness, it was sacred. And that's why, when Alexander Crane slapped him across the face, Ethan didn't react like a man insulted. He stood like a man who had already seen the worst and chosen discipline anyway. The courtyard at Buckingham Palace shimmered under the afternoon sun. Tourists snapped photos, children waved flags, and a warm breeze drifted through. But something shifted when Alexander Crane stepped forward. Shoulders back, ego blazing. He locked eyes on the nearest royal guard. It was Ethan. To most, the guards were part of the spectacle. Men in red tunics and tall bearskin hats, standing motionless like statues. But Alexander didn't see a man upholding centuries of tradition. He saw a prop, a target. With a smirk, he strutted forward, weaving through the crowd. "Let's see if he blinks," he said, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. Ethan didn't move. Alexander chuckled and waved a hand in front of the guard's face. "Come on, don't they teach you how to greet a billionaire?" His voice carried the smugness of someone used to control. "Where I come from, people show respect. They bow, they speak. They don't just stand there like furniture." Still, Ethan didn't move. Nearby, an elderly couple exchanged uneasy glances. A veteran in a faded Marine Corps hat narrowed his eyes. The atmosphere was changing. What had started as a joke was now veering towards something uglier. Alexander took another step, now within arm's reach. The air thickened. "You know who I am?" he said, tapping the edge of Ethan's polished brass button. "Alexander Crane. My company's worth more than this whole block. I sign deals before breakfast that feed entire cities. And you can't even nod your head." No response. Ethan's silence wasn't ignorance. It was intention, a stillness sharpened over years of discipline, first in combat, now in ceremony. But Alexander mistook it for weakness. Then came the moment, with the crowd watching, some recording, others frozen. Alexander reached out and grabbed Ethan's sleeve. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Follow orders," Alexander growled, yanking lightly. "That's how the world works. You follow power." Ethan didn't even glance at him. Not a flinch, not a flicker. But his stance hardened just slightly. Enough for another soldier across the yard to shift in position. That should have been enough, but it wasn't. Because in that instant something snapped in Alexander Crane. Years of unchecked power and entitlement boiled over. His lips curled, his eyes narrowed, and he raised his hand. Then came the slap. The sound cracked through the courtyard like a rifle shot. The blow struck Ethan across the cheek, his head jerking slightly to the side. His tall black hat shifted under the impact, a red mark bloomed beneath his eye. Children screamed, tourists gasped, phones dropped. And Ethan stood still. No reaction, no emotion, just silence. A silence so powerful, it swallowed the chaos. For a moment, London held its breath. Alexander, breathing hard, hands still raised, looked around triumphantly, expecting dominance. But all he saw were eyes, dozens of them, disbelief, judgment, disgust. Because in trying to assert power, he had revealed weakness. And now, the still man before him, the one he struck, was about to remind him what real power looks like. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lift a hand. He simply turned, slowly, with the kind of precision that comes not from habit but from history. Ethan Ward, still at full attention, spoke. "Sir, you have just struck a soldier of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while on active duty." The words didn't boom, they didn't echo, but they carried like thunder. Alexander blinked. The smug grin faded, his hand, still tingling from the slap, dropped to his side. "You may think this uniform is a costume," Ethan continued, eyes now fixed directly on the man who hit him. "But every thread was earned. Every crease pressed for men who never came home. This, He pointed briefly to his own chest where medals glinted beneath the sunlight. "This isn't for show. This is for sacrifice." Around them, the crowd was silent. A child asked, "Daddy, is that man in trouble?" "Yes," the father whispered, "and he should be." Ethan didn't flinch. "You wanted a reaction? You wanted to provoke someone into giving you power you didn't earn? Then listen closely, Mr. Crane, because this will be the only thing I give you today." He stepped forward once, just one step, not a threat, but a reclaiming of space. "I've stood in deserts where lives were lost, defending the values you mock. I've held dying brothers in my arms who wore this same red coat. I've bled for a country that lets you walk free, yet here you are, treating tradition like a stage and service like a game." Alexander's mouth opened, but no words came. "You speak of money," Ethan said, voice unwavering. "But tell me, can your wealth buy the courage it takes to stand still while insulted? Can it purchase the strength to remain silent when everything in you wants to shout? Can it erase the shame of raising your hand against someone who was trained to protect you?" Even the guards stationed at the far end of the courtyard had turned their gaze. Alexander shifted, clearly sweating now, his bravado gone, his world for the first time shaken. "I don't need to strike back," Ethan finished, "because you've already done enough damage to yourself." Just then, the captain's voice rang out from across the courtyard. "Guard, stand down." With disciplined grace, Ethan turned precisely 45 degrees, clicked his heels, and brought his hand up in a sharp salute. "Sir," he said, "assault reported, awaiting next command." Military police were already approaching from the perimeter. Alexander took a step back, but it was too late. One guard officer addressed him calmly. "Sir, you are under investigation for assault on active military personnel. Please come with us." Alexander looked around, as if expecting someone to defend him. No one moved. Tourists watched. Veterans stood tall. Even children, now quiet, seemed to understand something important had just taken place. Among the stunned crowd that witnessed the slap, one man stood a little taller than the rest, not because of height, but because of experience. His name was Harold Whitmore, 81 years old, former U.S. Army Staff Sergeant, and a veteran of the Korean War. He had been visiting London for the first time, accompanied by his granddaughter. They had come to see history, to witness ceremony, not conflict. But as he watched the guard remain silent in the face of outright humiliation, Harold's jaw tightened. His hand instinctively moved to the brim of his faded army cap, as if saluting the man whose restraint reminded him of soldiers he had once served beside. "That," he muttered, voice low but firm, "is what discipline looks like." His granddaughter, just 14, looked up at him. "Why didn't the guard fight back?" she whispered. Harold didn't answer right away. He stared ahead, eyes glinting with the quiet pain of memory. Then he replied, "Because strength isn't just about force. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is nothing at all." Nearby, a group of younger tourists who had been laughing earlier now stood silent, visibly shaken. A mother held her child's hand tighter. A father recorded the moment, but not for entertainment, for teaching. Across the square, another elderly man, British, with Royal Navy medals pinned to his chest, nodded toward Harold. The two men exchanged a look, no words, just understanding. In that moment, the courtyard wasn't just a tourist stop. It became something more. A place where generations paused to reflect, where military service, regardless of nationality, was recognized, where silence didn't just follow an act of disrespect, it followed an act of quiet heroism. And Harold, he didn't reach for his phone. He didn't need to go viral. He simply whispered that guards earn more respect in 2 minutes than that CEO has in his whole life. Ethan didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He returned to his position, back to silence. And yet, no one in that crowd would ever look at a royal guard the same way again. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Alexander Crane's wrists, the sound seemed to echo louder than the slap he'd delivered just moments earlier. The man who once bragged about his power, his billion-dollar portfolio, his market-shifting influence, now stood humbled in a courtyard watched by everyday people. A man who had traveled across the Atlantic to dominate a meeting left with his legacy unraveling in the hands of military police. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he sputtered. The officer escorting him didn't blink. "We do, sir. That's exactly why this matters." Alexander's assistant, who once followed him like a shadow, now stood frozen near the palace gates. His tablet buzzed with urgent messages from the investment board. But none of that mattered anymore, because here, in this sacred space guarded by silent sentinels, no one was above respect. The crowd remained still, not gawking, but witnessing. Witnessing the collapse of entitlement, witnessing the triumph of restraint. As Alexander was led away, someone in the crowd began to clap, not in applause, but in acknowledgement, a slow, respectful gesture. It spread. A few others joined, then silence returned. Not one person cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. Ethan Ward, still at attention, bore the faint red mark on his cheek like a medal. He hadn't moved. He hadn't lashed out, but he had won something far greater than any courtroom could award, the moral high ground. The veteran from earlier stepped forward, removing his worn cap. "You stood tall, son," he said quietly. "Some of the hardest battles are fought in silence." Ethan gave a small, precise nod, the only gesture he'd make all day. Elsewhere, the story was already spreading. Footage of the incident appeared on social media from multiple angles. But this wasn't just another viral moment. It was a message. The headlines didn't focus on Alexander's wealth or past success. They focused on Ethan's discipline. Guard responds to assault with dignity. Silence stronger than violence. Royal duty meets modern arrogance. Guess who won? News outlets picked it up. Retired generals commented. Faith leaders used the story in sermons. Veterans posted tributes online. Because in a world that often seems driven by outrage and ego, here was a moment when calm courage stood its ground. And it wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, it was quiet, it was composed, it was timeless. Back at the palace, tourists continued their day. But many paused longer near the guards, offering quiet nods or whispered thanks. Parents explained to their children why that man in red didn't respond with anger, why he stood firm. "This is what strength looks like," the mother said gently to her son. "Not fists, not shouting, just grace under pressure." Ethan never asked for the spotlight, but for a brief moment, the world turned its gaze toward him, and what they saw was not just a uniform, but a standard. A reminder that character still matters, that some uniform still means something. That real power isn't in how loudly you speak, but in how silently you stand when tested. Imagine for a moment that you were in Ethan's place. A decorated veteran, a man trained not just in combat but in self-control, standing in uniform under the blazing London sun. Your body aching, your mind alert. The noise of the crowd fades, but one voice doesn't. A man, rich, entitled, drunk, berates you for not bowing, then he lays a hand on your uniform, and finally he slaps you in the face. The sting is real, but the test, that goes deeper. What would you have done? Would you have broken formation, raised your voice, fought back? Or would you have done what Ethan Ward did? Stand firm, stay silent, and let your dignity speak louder than any outburst ever could. Ethan's reaction wasn't passive. It was powerful. It was a reminder that restraint is not weakness. It is strength with purpose. It takes far more courage to endure than to explode. And in that moment, in front of the world, he reminded all of us that the greatest victories don't always come from winning a fight, but from standing for what is right. For many watching, this wasn't just about a disrespectful CEO or a stoic soldier. It was about what we've lost and what we need to find again: honor, discipline, respect for tradition, the ability to stand still when it counts. In today's world where everything moves fast, where power is loud and dignity is too often forgotten, Ethan's quiet resolve taught a lesson generations need to remember: that real strength doesn't need to shout. The crown that undergoes the same test of civilization and self-control are worth preserving, and that sometimes the most powerful statement is saying nothing at all. Pause, visual, the guard returning to stillness. Fade to Ethan's eyes, unmoving but resolute. Now we want to hear from you. If you were in Ethan's shoes, how would you have handled that moment? Would you have stood firm? Or would emotion have gotten the best of you? From 1 to 10, how powerful was this moment to you? Leave your number in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of values you were raised to respect, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who still believes in quiet strength. And subscribe to Guard Royals for more true stories of courage, dignity, and tradition that still matters. Visual, calm shot of Buckingham Palace in late afternoon. Subtle American flag overlay, symbolizing shared values. Because in a world that seems to shout more than it listens, maybe it's time we remember the power of standing still.